A French unit is on patrol in Vietnam in 1954 during the final year of the First Indochina War. The unit is suddenly ambushed by North Vietnamese army forces, who kill the officers. Although the French soldiers kill many Viet Minh, the unit is soon overrun. Nguyen Huan orders the execution of all surviving French soldiers to discourage further French involvement in Vietnam. 11 years later, the United States had entered the Vietnam War. U.S. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore is depicted as dedicated and deeply committed to training troops under his command, the 7th Cavalry Regiment, who are preparing for deployment to Vietnam. Colonel Moore and his family relocate to their new residence, which after helicopters hover overhead. Colonel Moore explores the capabilities of the new rapid helicopters. Major Bruce Crandall and other helicopter aviators are playing baseball on their break. Crandall meets Colonel Moore, who expounds to Crandall that because of how low he flies, he is the resolution to his problem. He emphasizes how crucial his job will be in battle. Sergeant Major Plumley's exceedingly intense demeanor is introduced. Colonel Moore formally addresses his men, as well as introduces them to Plumley. He informs them that their steeds in the battle for the first time will be helicopters. The soldiers train and prepare for the capricious nature of the battle. Colonel Moore stresses the significance of understanding the role of the individual ranked above and below. Colonel Moore shares a prayer with his 5 children. After that, he elucidates to his wife how he thanks God for her every time he prays. Plumley, with his intense mode of thinking, tells Colonel Moore he will adhere to his pistol because of how close the adversary will be in battle. Colonel Moore's radio operator picks up a signal from the active and struggling advisor serving in Vietnam. Colonel Moore then goes on to explicate how each other is all they are going to have. Colonel Moore points out the fine leadership skills of Lieutenant Jack Geoghegan, while he takes control of his men by meticulously checking for blisters. Plumley also points out Sergeant Salvage's intense leadership skills. Led by Julie Moore, the women whose husbands have recently been admitted to the post-meet and discuss mutual interests while they get to know each other better. Barbara Geoghegan's water breaks. She delivers a baby girl. Jack Geoghegan then goes to church where he meets Colonel Moore. Moore gives Geoghegan advice on being a father and soldier. Moore prays to keep Geoghegan and his other men safe during battle. Colonel Moore awakens in the middle of the night and conducts more research. His wife Julie finds him and assures him he's the perfect man to lead his young soldiers. President Johnson's speech when he orders Colonel Moore's 1st Air Mobile Division to Vietnam is captured on TV. Colonel Moore and his men celebrate and share quality time with their loved ones before they leave the following day. Colonel Moore also finds out here that he will be going into battle under strength, losing 1/3 of his already trained men. He is reminded of the prior efforts of the 1st Battalion of 7th Cavalry, the same regiment as General Custer, who were all eradicated by the Vietnamese. He goes home and completes his final will. Colonel Moore delivers a compelling final speech, stating that he will be the first to step on the field and last to step off while leaving no man dead or alive behind. Back in his residence, Colonel Moore tucks each of his children into bed and spends his final night home with his wife. A few hours later, Geoghegan departs from his wife and newborn baby. The soldiers gather to leave. The soldiers arrive in South Vietnam at a base camp in helicopters. The war is between the North Vietnamese, who are backed by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist allies, and the South Vietnamese, who are supported by the United States and other anti-communist allies. Colonel Moore is briefed on where the war has reached and is instructed to locate the enemy and exterminate them. He has 395 American soldiers ready for war. Colonel Moore and Plumley have a cigar while they discuss strategy. The soldiers board the helicopters and take off to the enemy grounds. They arrive for battle in the Ia Drang River Valley. The North Vietnamese find out about their arrival and prepare. Colonel Moore is the first to land. The soldiers all fire in caution. A platoon begins a pursuit into the jungle after a scout. Colonel Moore and Plumley capture another North Vietnamese Army lookout, who informs them that the location they were sent to is actually the base camp for a veteran North Vietnamese Army division of more than 4,000 men. Colonel Moore orders all troops to hold positions but not in time to prevent the platoon from pursuing an enemy scout. The stranded platoon then attempts to retreat while losing the lives of many soldiers. The stranded platoon resorts to hiding in the grass after losing their commanding officer and multiple others who attempt to lead. Sergeant Ernie Savage assumes control and orders everyone to remain lying down. Colonel Moore remains composed while elucidating to the radio advisor to call in air support at the landing zone for the rest of his men to arrive. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Huu and orders a strategy to flank Colonel Moore and his troops at the landing zone. Colonel Moore realizes this. The commanding officer of the stranded platoon perishes eventually from leading his men after the scout. Sergeant Savage is now in charge. Colonel Nguyen Huan plans to overwhelm the landing zones to choke supply and escape routes. He calls for more soldiers. More American troops rapidly arrive on the scene at a hot landing zone. Colonel Moore bravely issues orders. Colonel Moore realizes Colonel Nguyen Huan will use the creek bed to try to flank. He orders them to secure it before they do. War on the ground continues as Colonel Moore gives orders to his men on the radio. Many Vietnamese soldiers and American soldiers die. Colonel Moore orders his radio assistant to call air support and bomb the enemy spots. Crandall, another helicopter pilot, escorts in medevac helicopters. One gets shot down, so Crandall decides to stay longer and assist in evacuating the wounded under heavy fire. Due to the hot landing zone, Plumlee carves out a new landing zone by blowing down trees and creating a clearing. Colonel Moore is informed headquarters wants him out. That doesn't make any sense to him. The generals at the headquarters think that it is a massacre of the American soldiers and that they have already lost. Colonel Moore saves Crandall's life as he lands at the landing zone to bring armor to the soldiers. The wounded soldiers are being put on board. A wounded soldier volunteers to let another evacuate before he does. He gets shot, and his body falls on the pile as the helicopter ascends. The stranded platoon is out of water and is losing more men. A lot of men from both parties die, and some are wounded badly. Geoghegan arrives in a chopper with other men but is attacked by the Vietnamese. A few of them escape. Some soldiers decide to reinforce the stranded platoon but are all gunned down. At night, journalist Joseph Galloway decides to take the next helicopter into the battle. Crandall allows him into his chopper. He meets Colonel Moore. He tells Galloway that he cannot guarantee his safety and that he should be careful, else he'll die. Crandall finally lands his helicopter at the base and gets yelled at by a senior officer for leaving his men behind. He responds with anger and pulls out his handgun, telling him to go fight the real enemies, for he had to transport the wounded first and leave the other soldiers to fight. Sergeant Savage and the stranded platoon are still fighting for their lives. The rescuing platoon notifies them they will not make it there before the night is over. Geoghegan and his troops secure the ridge without getting much sleep. Colonel Moore comforts them. Soon, a large enemy force attacks. The casualties in Vietnam are shown taking an emotional toll at Fort Benning, Georgia. Moore's wife, Julie, and Geoghegan's wife, Barbara Geoghegan, assume the task of delivering telegrams to inform families, mostly soldiers' wives like themselves, about the soldiers being killed in action. As they spread the telegrams to the widows, they all emotionally break down in tears mourning their husbands. Colonel Moore prays over the dead from the first day of battle. Galloway shares his purpose in Vietnam with Colonel Moore. He tells Colonel Moore that most of his ancestors were in the army, and he is a journalist who wants to understand the war better by shooting pictures and videos and also make the rest of the world understand the war. Colonel Nguyen Huan congratulates his men on the day's battle and notes their accomplishments. Sergeant Savage and the rest of his platoon are hiding in the grass with Vietnamese patrols directly on top of them. They spot them, and they get into a rapid fight. Vietnamese soldiers at the spot are all killed, and a few American soldiers remain alive. Colonel Nguyen Huan prays for the dead soldiers he lost on the battlefield. Colonel Moore orders every soldier to fire 3 rounds at anything that looks suspicious. After they shoot, Vietnamese troops charge at them. Soldiers from both parties use heavy machine guns on each other, resulting in more deaths. Geoghegan goes out of his way to rescue a downed soldier. He gets shot and killed. A Vietnamese soldier tries to sneak and attack Colonel Moore from behind. Colonel Moore sees and shoots him down. Galloway is almost shot down taking pictures but is rescued by Plumlee. Plumlee then forcefully hands Galloway an M16 rifle. Colonel Moore tells the mortar team to urinate on the mortars to cool them off for immediate use. Galloway joins the soldiers while they are attacked by a group of enemy soldiers who aggressively charge at them. Colonel Moore paces around each side of the battlefield and realizes they have been overrun. At the point of breaking and being completely overrun by the enemy, Moore orders his radio man to call in Broken Arrow, indicating that Moore's position is being overrun and can no longer be defended, and requesting all available combat aircraft to attack the enemy. The aircraft attack with bombs, napalm, and machine guns, massacring many NVAs and Viet Cong. But an accident occurs dangerously close to Moore's men, killing some of Moore's soldiers, but successfully repelling the second Vietnamese attack. After the Vietnamese forces are repelled, a squad goes into the jungle to rescue the surviving men of the stranded platoon led by Sergeant Savage. After 40 men have been killed in battle, a group of new soldiers arrives and takes their place on the radio. General Westmoreland orders Colonel Moore to leave, but he refuses and continues to fight and find all of his men. He finds Jigigan's dead body. Julie Moore gets the news and goes to tell Barbara. Colonel Moore is distraught about his death. Colonel Moore denies pulling out, even though all have been ordered to leave. Moore's troops regroup, secure the area, and stop at the base of a hill, where Moore surmises the Vietnamese division headquarters is holed up in tunnels. At the same time, the Vietnamese commander plans a final assault on the Americans and sends out most of his troops to carry out the attack. The Vietnamese have set up strong defense emplacements near the hidden entrance of the underground passage to the command post spoken of by the scout. Hal and his men charge right at them into a seemingly impending massacre. But before the Vietnamese can fire, Major Bruce Snakeshit Crandall and other helicopter gunships attack the Vietnamese, destroying the bulk of the enemy force. Nguyen Huan, the Vietnamese commander, is alerted that the Americans have broken through their lines and there are no soldiers between the Americans and their command post. The Vietnamese commander quickly orders the headquarters evacuated. Moore, having achieved his objective, returns to the LZ helicopter landing zone to be picked up. True to his speech to his soldiers before deploying, only after all of his men, including the dead and wounded, are removed from the battlefield does he step onto a helicopter and fly out of the valley. While the Vietnamese are collecting their dead, Nguyen Huan, holding a small damaged American flag, tells one of his officers, "Such a tragedy. They will think this was their victory, so this will become an American war, and the end will be the same as the French, except for the numbers who will die before we get there." At the end of the movie, it is revealed that the landing zone immediately reverted to North Vietnamese hands after the American troops were airlifted out. Hal Moore, after nearly a year, he returned home safely to Julie and his family. His superiors congratulated him for killing over 1,800 North Vietnamese army. An older Moore visits the Vietnam War Memorial and looks at the names of the soldiers who fell at Ia Drang. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our video. Watch the next recaps on the screen and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.